지금부터 우리는 중세시대 유럽의 밤으로 떠납니다. 마녀, 늑대인간, 미스터리한 존재가 기록된 역사의 조각들을 따라서 말이죠.
I decided to wander across central and northern Italy and reading as many witchcraft trials as I could at random.
중세 종교 재판 기록을 통해 유럽 민중의 역사를 분석해온 미시사의 개척자 카를로 긴즈부르그. 그가 오늘 마녀들의 진술 뒤에 숨겨진 유럽 역사의 어두운 비밀을 밝힙니다.
Since the antiquity, the night in Europe was inhabited by beings provided with supernatural powers, witches, benandanti, werewolves, meaning men who were able to turn into wolves. The beliefs concerning those men, labeled loups-garous, werewolfen, lupi mannari, werewolves, lobisomem, have been recorded outside Europe as well. This variety was accompanied by a number of recurrent elements. First of all, the transformation was always temporary, albeit of varying duration. 9 years in Arcadia, 7 years in medieval Ireland, 12 days in the Germanic and Baltic countries. Secondly, it was preceded by gestures of a ritual character. The werewolf undresses and hangs his clothes on the branches of an oak or sets them on the ground, urinating all around them. Then he crosses a pond or a river. In the crossing and attended gestures, a rite of passage has been identified. More precisely, the initiatory ceremony, or the equivalent of the crossing of the infernal river that separates the world of the living from that of the dead. According to the widespread image, the werewolves were supposedly malevolent, diabolical figures who attacked cattle and sheep, and sometimes even infants as well. The analogy with witches is evident, but as in the case of witches, traces of a different layer of beliefs occasionally emerge that had been turned into a diabolical stereotype. In a treatise entitled Christian Consideration and Memory on Magic, published in Heidelberg in 1585, the author, Hermann Wedekind, at a certain moment, Wedekind, born in Livonia, in the Baltic countries, and professor at the University of Riga, mentioned a conversation he had with a werewolf who had been incarcerated. The man, Wedekind remembered, behaved like a crazy person. He laughed, skipped about. The night before Easter, he told his astonished interlocutor, he had transformed himself into a wolf. After freeing himself from his shackles, he had escaped through the window, heading for an immense river. But why had he returned to prison? They had asked him. I had to do it. The master wishes it. About this master, Wedekind noted retrospectively, he spoke with great emphasis. Some more elements of Wedekind's conversation with the werewolf were included in another treatise by Kaspar Poitzer, published 5 years before. Werewolves boast of deterring witches and of fighting them when they have transformed into butterflies. They take on, or at least they believe they take on, the guise of a wolf in the 12 days between Christmas and Epiphany, compelled to do so by the apparition of a lame child. They are driven in their thousands by a tall man armed with an iron hip towards the bank of an enormous river. Which they cross without getting wet, because that man separates its waters with a lash of his whip. They attack cattle, but cannot harm to human beings. The same details reappear at the opposite side of Europe, in the French part of the Basque country, close to the Pyrenees. In the early 17th century, an intensive witch hunt took place in that region. A few years later, Pierre Delancre, who had been actively involved in those trials as a judge, he was royal consular at the Parliament of Bordeaux, published a treatise based on his own experience, treatise on the inconstancy of evil angels and demons, that included a broad discussion on witches and witchcraft. Delancre spoke at length of werewolves and diabolical transformations, but he also mentioned that, oddly enough, some werewolves claimed to be the enemies of witches. In his work, Delancre described in detail the case of Jean Grenier, a 13-year-old boy who had been put on trial in 1603 as a werewolf and condemned to spend his life in a Franciscan convent. Due to his young age, he had not been subjected to torture. In 1610, Delancre, clearly intrigued, decided to have a long conversation with the young man. After a vivid description of Jean Grenier's physical appearance, Delancre remarked, "He was not in the least an idiot. He naively confessed to me," Delancre went on, "that he had been a werewolf, and therefore he had run across the country by order of the Lord of the Forest. He said this freely to everybody, without denying anything. In the past," Delancre explained, "it has been told that this Lord of Forest hunts down witches and wizards across woods and fields and takes them out of their coffins when they die, enjoying tormenting and pursuing them even after their death." The young werewolf, commented Delancre, did not invent the name of Lord of the Forest as labels the evil spirit. Delancre had no doubts. The Lord of the Forest, the big black man who had given Jean Grenier his wolf's skin, was a demon. But Delancre also duly recorded the beliefs related to the Lord of the Forest, associating him with the narratives he had read about the Baltic werewolves as enemies of the witches. One more Livonian case that took place many decades later would strengthen Delancre's comparison. In 1692, at Jurgensburg in Livonia, an 80-year-old man named Thies, whom the townsmen considered an idolater, confessed to the judges interrogating him that he was a werewolf. 3 times a year, he said, on St. Lucy's night before Christmas, the night of St. John and of the Pentecost, the werewolves of Livonia descend into hell to fight with the devil and the sorcerers. And armed with iron whips, the werewolves pursue the devil and sorcerers who are armed with broomsticks wrapped in horse tails. At stake in the battles was the fertility of the fields. The sorcerers steal the grain shoots, and if they cannot wrest it from them, famine will ensue. However, that year the Livonian and the Russian werewolves had both won. The harvest of barley and of rye was going to be abundant. There was also going to be sufficient fish for everyone. In vain, the judges tried to induce the old man to admit that he had made a pact with the devil. This obstinately continued to repeat that the worst enemies of the devil and the sorcerers were werewolves like himself. After death, they would go to paradise. Since he refused to repent, he was sentenced to 10 lashes of the whip. Although ecstatic sleep is absent in the trial against these, it is mentioned in some 17th century dissertations about the werewolves discussed at the University of Leipzig and Wittenberg. 1 century earlier, ecstasy was identified by Kaspar in the middle of the 16th century as a distinctive feature of the Laplandic magicians, meaning shamans falling into catalepsy. 24 hours having passed with the return of the spirit, as though from a deep sleep, the inanimate body reawakens with a groan, almost as though called back to life from the death into which it had fallen. 30 years later, the author of an anonymous testimony about the Benandante Toffolo di Buri, herdsman from a village near Monfalcone, used very similar terms. When he is forced to join combat, he is overcome by a very deep sleep, and sleeping belly up as the spirit issues forth, one hears him utter 3 groans, as oftentimes do those who are dying. Shamans and the protagonists of the ecstatic cults, sparsely recorded on the European continent, considered themselves, and were considered, mediators between the living and the dead, insofar as ecstasy, a temporary death, gave them the power to make a temporary journey to the great beyond. We are bound to conclude that one and the same mythical pattern has been adopted and adapted by societies very different from one another in ecological, economic, and social respects. But then, the diabolical core of the witches' Sabbath stereotype was imposed through psychological and physical pressures by clerical and lay judges upon this deep layer of shamanic beliefs. Except for the Friulian case, only fragments of this layer survived. But the Inquisitors' attempt to turn the Benandante into witches suggests that something similar took place elsewhere.